June 6, 1944. The English Channel was alive with the largest armada the world had ever seen. Over 5,000 ships cut through the dark waters toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. Aboard those vessels, over 150,000 men prepared for what would become the most significant military operation in human history. Among them were 225 men who faced perhaps the most impossible mission of all. While thousands would storm the beaches, these men would climb, under fire, up sheer cliffs, with the fate of the entire invasion hanging in the balance. This is the story of the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. A story of courage that defies imagination, a story where ordinary men accomplished the extraordinary, and a story that nearly ended in tragedy before it even began. The strategic nightmare Pointe du Hoc. Even the name sounds ominous. It's a rocky promontory jutting out into the English Channel on the northwestern coast of Normandy. A knife blade of land thrust between two beaches that would soon be written into history: Utah Beach to the west, Omaha Beach to the east. But what made this piece of land so critical wasn't just its location, it was what sat on top of it. German intelligence had fortified Pointe du Hoc as part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the massive defensive barrier designed to repel any Allied invasion. And at Pointe du Hoc they had positioned 6 French-made 155mm artillery guns. These weren't just any weapons. With a range of 25 kilometers, these massive guns could rain destruction on both landing beaches simultaneously. They could tear through the invasion fleet anchored offshore. They could turn D-Day into a catastrophe. The cliffs themselves rose 100 feet straight up from the beach. In some places, they were actually higher, closer to 110 feet, sheer walls of rock and earth, eroded by centuries of wind and waves. At the top, German soldiers had created an intricate network of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, observation posts, and artillery positions. The entire clifftop was a fortress, bristling with defensive positions. Allied commanders understood the threat immediately. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, made it clear those guns had to be silenced. General Omar Bradley, who would command all American forces during the invasion, called it the most dangerous mission of D-Day, and he wasn't exaggerating. For months before the invasion, Allied bombers had pounded Pointe du Hoc. The U.S. 8th Air Force and the British Royal Air Force had dropped hundreds of tons of explosives on the position. The ground had been churned into a moonscape of craters, but aerial reconnaissance suggested that the concrete fortifications had survived. Those guns were still there, still operational, still a mortal threat. The problem was simple and terrifying. Bombing alone wouldn't be enough. Someone would have to go up there. Someone would have to climb those cliffs, fight through the German defenders, and destroy those guns with their own hands. That someone would be the Rangers. The men who would climb the Rangers were America's elite. Modeled after the British commandos, they were volunteers selected from the toughest soldiers in the Army. To even be considered for the Rangers, you had to be in peak physical condition. You had to show mental toughness, quick thinking under pressure, and an almost reckless courage. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had been activated in April 1943 at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Its commander was a former Texas farmer and schoolteacher named Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. At 33, Rudder was older than many of his men, but he had the respect of every single Ranger under his command. He led from the front, never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and had an uncanny ability to stay calm under the most intense pressure. When General Eisenhower first presented Rudder with the Pointe du Hoc mission, the Ranger commander looked at the aerial photographs and thought it was a joke. Scale cliffs while being shot at from above? It seemed impossible. But Rudder looked at his men, looked back at the photographs, and said simply, "We'll do it." The Rangers who would assault Pointe du Hoc came from all across America. There was First Sergeant Leonard Lommel from New Jersey, a 24-year-old former college athlete who led D Company's 2nd Platoon. There was Sergeant Jack Kuhn, who would fight alongside Lommel in the mission's most critical moments. There was Lieutenant James Eichner, who would later vividly describe the chaos of the landing. These were farmers, factory workers, students, men from big cities and small towns. What they had in common was an unshakable determination. Training for the mission began in Scotland, where the Rangers underwent the notoriously brutal British Commando course. They ran obstacle courses under live fire. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water. They learned demolition techniques, close quarters combat, and small unit tactics. But most importantly, they learned to climb. The English coast near Swanage provided cliffs similar to those they would face in Normandy. Day after day, the Rangers made the 5-mile run from their camp to the cliffs. They would scale the 90-foot walls 3 to 5 times, then run back, every day, rain or shine, until climbing became second nature. They trained with specialized equipment designed specifically for Pointe du Hoc. There were rope ladders that could be fired up the cliff face using rockets. There were grappling hooks attached to ropes, designed to catch on the cliff top. There were even DUKWs, amphibious vehicles called ducks, fitted with 100-foot extension ladders, borrowed from the London Fire Department. Machine guns were mounted at the top of these ladders to provide covering fire. The training was exhausting, dangerous, and relentless. Some men washed out, unable to keep up with the brutal pace. Others thrived. But all of them knew that when the day came, there would be no second chances. The plan was precise, but risky. Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion would make the assault. They would land at the base of the cliffs at exactly 6:30 in the morning, synchronized with the main landings on the beaches. Naval bombardment and airstrikes would soften up the defenses in the minutes before landing. Then the Rangers would go up. If they succeeded, if they could signal from the cliff top by 7 a.m., then reinforcements would follow. Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers, plus the entire 5th Ranger Battalion, over 500 more men who would help secure the position and push inland. If they failed to signal by 7, those reinforcements would divert to Omaha Beach instead. Everything depended on speed. Everything depended on surprise. And everything depended on men being willing to climb into almost certain end. The hours before dawn, the night of June 5, 1944, the Rangers boarded their ships. The invasion had been postponed 24 hours due to terrible weather. Now, as the ships rolled in heavy seas, many of the men were seasick. They tried to rest, tried to eat, tried to keep their minds off what was coming. Some wrote letters home. Others checked and rechecked their equipment. Every Ranger carried an incredible load: assault vest, gas mask, ammunition, helmet, grenades, weapons ranging from Thompson submachine guns to M1 Garands, boxes of rope, and rocket launchers for firing the grappling hooks. Some carried thermite grenades, special incendiary devices designed to melt through metal and destroy artillery pieces from the inside. The weight was crushing, over 60 pounds of gear on top of their own body weight, and they would have to carry all of it up a 100-foot cliff while being shot at. At 4:05 in the morning, the ship's public address system crackled to life. Rangers, man your craft. It was time. The men climbed down cargo nets in the darkness, descending into the small British landing craft that would take them to shore. The LCA's, landing craft assault, were cramped and uncomfortable. The sea was rough, waves smashing against the sides of the boats, water sprayed over the gunwales. Men huddled together, cold and wet, as the little boats began their journey toward the French coast. From the ships behind them came the thunder of naval guns. The bombardment had begun. The battleship USS Texas and the cruiser HMS Glasgow poured shells onto Pointe du Hoc. Then the destroyers USS Satterley and HMS Talabant joined in. The morning sky lit up with the flash of explosions. At 6 a.m., Bombers from the U.S. 9th Air Force roared overhead, dropping their payloads on the German positions. The Rangers could feel the concussion of the explosions even from miles out at sea. It sounded like the end of the world. Good, they thought. Maybe the Germans won't be able to fight back. Maybe the bombardment will do the job for us. They were wrong. Navigation error. As dawn broke on June 6th, something went terribly wrong. The Rangers were supposed to land directly at the base of Pointe du Hoc at 6:30 a.m., but the combination of strong currents, heavy seas, and a malfunction in the new radar navigation system pushed the flotilla off course. Way off course? Nearly 2 miles to the east. It was Rudder, standing in the lead landing craft, who first realized the mistake. Through the haze and smoke he could see land ahead, but it wasn't the distinctive shape of Pointe du Hoc. They were heading straight for the wrong beach, directly into the most heavily defended section of the German line. "Turn around," Rudder shouted over the roar of the engines and explosions. "We're at the wrong place." The flotilla wheeled around, the small boats fighting against the current and waves. Every minute of delay was critical. The element of surprise was already gone. The naval bombardment had stopped at 6:30, assuming the Rangers would be landing. Now the Germans would have time to recover, to man their positions, to prepare. Worse, the 500 Rangers who were supposed to follow as reinforcements were waiting for the signal. If Rudder didn't send up flares from the clifftop by 7:62, those men would be diverted to Omaha Beach. The margin for error had just become impossibly thin. The Rangers finally reached the base of Pointe du Hoc at 7:10 a.m., 40 minutes late. The sun was now fully up. There would be no cover of darkness, no surprise. The Germans would see them coming every step of the way. As the landing craft approached the beach, disaster struck. One boat hit an underwater obstacle and sank. Men weighed down by equipment struggled in the water. Some drowned, pulled under by the weight of their gear, disappearing into underwater bomb craters that pocked the sea floor. Others were rescued by their comrades, pulled gasping into other boats. Then the German fire began. Under fire. The sound was overwhelming. Machine gun bullets tore into the wooden sides of the landing craft. Mortar rounds exploded in the water, sending up geysers of spray. The Rangers could hear the distinctive sound of German potato masher grenades detonating on the beach ahead. The first landing craft hit the shore. The ramp dropped. Lieutenant Eichner, the last man off his boat, would later remember, "I ran down the ramp and into the water about up to my knees and headed across the beach. Enemy rounds were kicking up the sand and pinging off the rocks." Men rushed forward, seeking cover at the base of the cliff. The beach was a nightmare. The Allied bombardment had brought down huge sections of the cliff face, creating piles of earth and rock that actually helped the Rangers, giving them something to hide behind and shortening the climb. But the German fire was murderous. From above, the defenders threw grenades down at the Rangers. The explosives bounced off the cliff face before detonating. Machine gun fire swept the beach. German soldiers dropped rocks and chunks of debris, trying to crush the Americans below. The destroyers offshore, seeing the Rangers' desperate situation, moved in dangerously close. The USS Satterlee came within 1,000 yards of shore, well within range of German coastal guns, to provide covering fire. The destroyers' guns hammered the German positions, trying to suppress the fire. But there was no time to wait for the bombardment to do its work. The Rangers had to move, now. "Hit the cliff!" Rudder shouted. The men began firing their grappling hook rockets. Some had been water-soaked during the rough journey to shore. The rockets fizzled or fired weakly, the ropes falling short of the clifftop. Others flew true but were cut by German soldiers above. Some Germans grabbed the ropes, trying to pull them up or shake the Rangers off. But other ropes had flares attached to them, and the Germans, thinking they might be explosives, avoided those lines. The two KWs with the 100-foot ladders struggled in the soft sand and debris. One KW's engine was hit by German fire. 3 Rangers in that vehicle became casualties, but other ladders were raised, swaying dangerously as rangers climbed upward. Most of the men, though, went up the old-fashioned way, hand over hand, using the ropes and whatever handholds they could find in the cliff face. The climb was agony, arms burning, legs shaking, lungs heaving, all while carrying 60 pounds of equipment. Below them, comrades fell wounded or worse on the beach. Above them, Germans threw grenades and fired down at point-blank range. Some rangers lost their grip and fell, only to get up and start climbing again. The ropes were slick with sea spray and blood. Men's hands were raw and bleeding from gripping the rough hemp. One ranger, struggling near the top, shouted to his comrade Leonard Lommel that he wasn't going to make it. Lommel, already exhausted, was too far away to help. But another ranger, Leonard Rubin, a former college football player, came running past. Lommel yelled for Rubin to help. Rubin reached over the edge of the cliff and physically hauled his fellow ranger to safety by sheer strength. Moments like that defined the assault. When one man faltered, another stepped up. When someone fell, someone else took their place and kept climbing. At 7:40 a.m., just 30 minutes after hitting the beach, the first rangers reached the top of Pointe du Hoc. They had done the impossible, but the hardest part was just beginning. The shocking discovery. The top of Pointe du Hoc looked like the surface of an alien world. Decades of naval bombardment, airstrikes, and artillery fire had transformed the clifftop into a lunar landscape. Enormous craters pocked the ground. The earth was churned and broken. Smoke drifted across the scene, giving everything an apocalyptic quality. The rangers spread out immediately, moving in small groups from crater to crater, expecting German fire at any moment. They fought through to the massive concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that honeycombed the position, and then they made a discovery that stopped them cold. The guns weren't there. The rangers rushed to the 6 large circular gun emplacements. Each position was empty. In some cases, the Germans had placed wooden telephone poles painted to look like artillery pieces from the air, decoys, meant to fool Allied reconnaissance. The disappointment was crushing. Men had given everything to reach this position. Comrades had fallen on the beach below. And for what? For telephone poles? But there was no time for despair. The Rangers had trained for this contingency. If the guns weren't in their primary position, they had to be nearby somewhere. The Germans wouldn't have simply abandoned such powerful weapons. They must have moved them to protect them from the bombardment. The Rangers pushed forward from the clifftop, engaging German defenders in fierce firefights. The German 916th Grenadier Regiment, recovering from the shock of the bombardment, was beginning to counterattack. Snipers in the rubble picked off unwary Rangers. Machine gun nests had to be cleared one by one. The fighting was close and brutal. Meanwhile, Rudder, though already wounded, established a command post in one of the German bunkers. He needed to organize the defense and coordinate the search for the guns. The Rangers' secondary objective was to cut the coastal road that ran behind Pointe du Hoc, preventing German reinforcements from reaching Omaha Beach. That mission had to continue even as they searched. The most important patrol First Sergeant Leonard Lommel had landed with 22 men. By the time they fought their way inland, only 12 remained able to fight. 10 had been lost in the landing and the climb, but Lommel kept pushing forward, leading his men south toward the coastal road. The fighting was constant. German strong points had to be reduced. Snipers had to be neutralized. Every hedgerow could hide an enemy machine gun nest. The Rangers moved carefully, using the bomb craters for cover, but always advancing. After about an hour of brutal combat, Lommel and his depleted squad reached the coastal highway. They set up a roadblock as ordered, positioning themselves to stop any German movement along the road. But the guns were still missing, and without finding and destroying those guns, the mission wasn't complete. Lommel looked around. His men were exhausted, some wounded, all running low on ammunition. He made a decision. He would take just one man, Sergeant Jack Kuhn, and scout ahead. The rest would hold the roadblock. "Jack," Lommel said quietly, Those guns have to be somewhere. Come on." The two rangers moved forward carefully, following a sunken farm road that led inland. The road showed heavy vehicle tracks, recent ones. Something big had moved through here. They advanced about 250 meters, moving slowly, weapons ready, and then Lommel stopped. He held up his hand, turned to Kuhn, and in a half-whisper said, "Jack, here they are. We've found them. Here are the guns. Yulchen, there, hidden in an orchard less than a kilometer from their original positions, concealed under camouflage netting, sat 5 of the 6 massive 155-millimeter guns. They were in firing positions pointed toward Utah Beach. Around them were piles of ammunition ready to be loaded. These weapons could still rain destruction on the invasion beaches. But, incredibly, unbelievably, there were no German soldiers guarding them. Lommel scanned the area. About 100 meters away, across an open field, he could see roughly 100 German soldiers. They appeared to be forming up, probably preparing to man the guns. They must have pulled back during the naval bombardment, afraid that a stray shell would set off the ammunition dump. Now they were getting ready to return to action. There wasn't much time. "Give me your grenades, Jack," Lommel said. "Cover me." Without hesitation, Lommel ran toward the guns. He carried thermite grenades, special incendiary devices that burned at incredibly high temperatures. They were designed specifically for destroying artillery pieces. The thermite would melt through the traversing and recoil mechanisms, rendering the guns useless. Lommel placed thermite grenades in 2 of the guns, destroying their critical mechanisms. Then he smashed the sights of the remaining 3 guns with the butt of his Thompson submachine gun. But he needed more grenades. The job wasn't finished. "Jack, we've got to get more thermite grenades," Lommel said. The 2 rangers sprinted back to the coastal road, collected all the thermite grenades they could find from the other rangers at the roadblock, and ran back to the orchard. By now the German soldiers had noticed something was wrong. They began moving toward the guns, but Lommel was faster. He placed thermite grenades in the remaining guns, completely disabling all 5 pieces of artillery. The mission was accomplished. At 9 a.m. on June 6, 1944, less than 2 hours after landing on the beach below Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers had found and destroyed the guns that threatened the entire invasion. But they were far from safe. Isolated and surrounded. Word of the gun's destruction spread quickly among the Rangers still on Pointe du Hoc. There was a brief moment of elation. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had completed their primary mission. But the situation was desperate. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed, casualties had been heavy. About 135 men were out of action, either wounded or lost. That left roughly 90 Rangers still able to fight. They held a small perimeter on the clifftop, but they were surrounded by German forces who were now fully alert and preparing counterattacks. The reinforcements hadn't come. Rudder's delayed landing meant he couldn't send up the flares by 7:00 a.m. The 500 Rangers from Companies A and B and the 5th Ranger Battalion had been diverted to Omaha Beach, where they would play a crucial role in turning the tide of that desperate fight. But it meant the men at Pointe du Hoc were on their own. Supplies were running critically low. Ammunition was being rationed carefully. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Food and water were scarce. The Rangers gathered what they could from fallen comrades and captured German positions. But it wasn't enough. And the Germans were coming. The 916th Grenadier Regiment, recovering from the shock of the invasion, launched the first counterattack that afternoon. German infantry, supported by mortars, tried to overwhelm the Ranger positions. The fighting was savage. The Rangers used every weapon they had. Every bullet counted. They held the Germans back, but barely. That night was a nightmare. The Germans launched probe after probe, trying to find weak points in the Ranger line. Flares lit up the darkness. The sound of gunfire was constant. The Rangers couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. They just held on. A message was sent to an offshore naval vessel. Located Pointe du Hoc. Mission accomplished. Need ammunition and reinforcement. Many casualties. No reinforcements came. The naval ships engaged in supporting the main landings and under threat from German coastal batteries couldn't spare the resources. On June 7th, the second day, the situation deteriorated further. The Germans launched 3 major counterattacks. Each time, the thin line of Rangers held, but each time their perimeter shrank a little more. Men fought with whatever they had. When ammunition ran out, they used captured German weapons. When grenades were gone, they threw rocks. Some Rangers were captured during these attacks. Others were lost in the brutal fighting. The defensive perimeter was pushed back, closer and closer to the cliff edge. At one point, the Rangers controlled only a strip of land along the cliff top, barely clinging to the position they had fought so hard to take. Lieutenant Rudder, wounded multiple times by now but still in command, moved among his men, encouraging them, reorganizing defenses, making sure every shot counted. His presence kept the Rangers going when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm them. On the night of June 7th, a small group from the 5th Ranger Battalion, just 23 men, managed to fight their way through from Omaha Beach and link up with the defenders. It wasn't much, but it was something. It meant they weren't completely alone. It meant someone knew they were still fighting, but the respite was brief. The German counterattacks continued through the second night. The sound of fighting echoed across the clifftop. Tracers lit up the darkness. The smell of cordite and smoke hung heavy in the air. The Rangers held. Somehow, impossibly, they held. The relief. The morning of June 8th dawned on a scene of devastation. The clifftop of Pointe du Hoc looked like a vision of hell. Shattered bunkers, bomb craters filled with debris, bodies of the fallen, both American and German. The surviving Rangers were hollow-eyed, exhausted, nearly out of ammunition. And then they heard it, the rumble of tanks. At first there was panic. Were these German tanks coming to finish them off? The Rangers prepared for a last stand. They had fought for 2 days and nights. They wouldn't surrender now. But then they saw the markings. American tanks. Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion, accompanied by infantry from the 116th Regiment, and more Rangers from the 5th Battalion. The relief had finally arrived. Rangers who had been certain they would never leave Pointe du Hoc alive stood and cheered, tears streaming down their faces. Men who hadn't slept in 48 hours, who had fought off attack after attack, who had watched comrades fall beside them, suddenly found the strength to smile. The battle for Pointe du Hoc was over. When the final count was made, the cost became clear. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed on the morning of June 6th, only about 90 were still standing and unwounded. That's a casualty rate of approximately 60%. Some companies had lost even more. The price had been terrible, but the mission was accomplished. The guns that could have devastated the invasion beaches were destroyed. The coastal road was cut. German reinforcements had been prevented from reaching Omaha Beach at a critical time, and, perhaps most importantly, the Rangers had proved that even the most impossible mission could be completed if men were brave enough to try. Why it mattered. In the decades since D-Day, some historians have questioned whether the assault on Pointe du Hoc was necessary. After all, the guns weren't in their primary positions when the Rangers arrived. Intelligence reports that came in just days before the invasion suggested the Germans had moved them. Did the Rangers need to make that terrible climb? The answer, unequivocally, is yes. First, while the guns weren't in their concrete casements, they were still very much operational and ready to fire. They were less than a kilometer away, in positions where they could still target both landing beaches. If Leonard Lommel and Jack Kuhn hadn't found and destroyed those guns, they would have been brought into action within hours. The carnage on Utah and Omaha beaches would have been far worse. Second, the Rangers didn't just destroy the guns. They cut the coastal road, preventing German reinforcements from moving between Utah and Omaha beaches during the critical first hours of the invasion. This allowed the American forces to establish and expand their beachheads without facing fresh German units that could have turned the tide. Third, the Rangers tied down significant German forces. The 916th Grenadier Regiment and elements of the 352nd Infantry Division spent 2 days trying to retake Pointe du Hoc instead of reinforcing the defenses at Omaha and Utah. Every German soldier fighting the Rangers was a German soldier who wasn't shooting at men on the beaches. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the assault on Pointe du Hoc demonstrated what Allied soldiers were capable of. When word spread of what the Rangers had accomplished, it inspired troops across the invasion front. If men could climb those cliffs under fire and complete their mission, then any objective could be achieved. General Eisenhower himself visited Pointe du Hoc after the war. Looking at the cliffs, scarred by battle, he said, "How in heaven's name did you ever do it?" It was a question many asked. The answer lay in training, courage, leadership, and an unwillingness to accept failure. The men who made it possible. The assault on Pointe du Hoc succeeded because of individual acts of heroism repeated dozens of times. Leonard Lommel received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for his actions in finding and destroying the guns. But Lommel always insisted he was just doing his job. After the war, he returned to New Jersey, became a lawyer and judge, and rarely spoke about his wartime service. When he did, he always emphasized the other Rangers, the ones who didn't make it home. Jack Kuhn, who covered Lommel during the destruction of the guns, also received high honors. The partnership between the two men in those critical moments potentially saved thousands of lives. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, wounded several times during the battle but refusing to be evacuated, continued to command the 2nd Ranger Battalion through the rest of the war. He later became president of Texas A&M University. His leadership at Pointe du Hoc became a case study in military academies around the world. The Rangers who fell at Pointe du Hoc are buried in the American Cemetery at Normandy or in cemeteries across the United States. Their sacrifice ensured the success of the invasion and, ultimately, the liberation of Europe. The legacy today, Pointe du Hoc, looks much as it did on June 9, 1944, when the guns fell silent. The French government and later the American Battle Monuments Commission have preserved the site. The bomb craters remain. The shattered bunkers stand as they were. Walking across the clifftop, you can still see the scars of battle. A simple granite monument sits atop one of the German bunkers. It was erected by the French to honor the Rangers who fought there. The inscription, in both French and English, tells the story of that incredible assault. President Ronald Reagan visited Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day in 1984. 62 surviving Rangers from the assault stood with him. Reagan's words captured what those men had accomplished. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The site draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. People from around the world come to stand at the cliff edge and look down at the beach below. They try to imagine what it must have been like to make that climb under fire. Most can't. It seems impossible. And yet, it happened. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Pointe du Hoc. It was one of the first American units to complete its D-Day objectives. The battalion would go on to fight through France into Germany, earning distinction at the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where they captured Hill 400, another impossible objective. But it was Pointe du Hoc that defined them. It was those 90 minutes of climbing under fire, those 2 days of holding against impossible odds. That moment when Leonard Lommel found the guns and, without hesitation, ran forward to destroy them. The question we must ask: Why did they do it? These were volunteers. They had joined the Rangers knowing the missions would be dangerous. They had trained knowing that many wouldn't survive. And when the moment came, when the landing craft dropped its ramp and German machine guns opened fire, they ran forward anyway. Why? The easy answer is duty. They were soldiers, following orders. But it goes deeper than that. These men believed in something larger than themselves. They believed that freeing Europe from Nazi tyranny was worth the risk. They believed that the men beside them, their brothers in arms, deserved their best effort. They believed that failure wasn't an option, not when so much was at stake. Lieutenant Eichner, looking back years later at the assault, said it perfectly. Had we not been there, we felt quite sure that those guns would have been put into operation, and they would have brought much death and destruction down on our men on the beaches and our ships at sea. We had a job to do, and we did it. That simple. That profound. A job to do, and they did it. The human cost. But we cannot tell this story without acknowledging the price. War is not a movie. There are no respawns, no retakes. When those Rangers fell on the beach or on the clifftop, they didn't get up again. They left behind families, sweethearts, children who would grow up without fathers. The mothers who received telegrams about Pointe du Hoc paid a price. The wives who waited for husbands who would never return paid a price. The children who grew up knowing their father only through photographs and stories paid a price. Every medal, every honor, every tribute is built on that foundation of loss. The Rangers who survived carried the weight of those who didn't for the rest of their lives. Leonard Lommel, receiving honors for his bravery, would always say that the real heroes were the men who didn't make it home. This is the terrible mathematics of war. Victory requires sacrifice. Freedom has a cost. And on June 6, 1944, at a place called Pointe du Hoc, 135 Rangers paid that cost so that others might live free. The lesson for us. What can we learn from Pointe du Hoc? What does this story, now 80 years in the past, have to teach us today? First, it teaches us about courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite fear. Every Ranger who climbed those cliffs was terrified. They just didn't let that terror stop them. Second, it teaches us about preparation. The Rangers succeeded because they had trained relentlessly. When the unexpected happened, when they landed late and under heavy fire, their training took over. They adapted, overcame, and accomplished the mission. Third, it teaches us about leadership. James Rudder led by example. He was wounded, but stayed with his men. Leonard Lommel took the initiative when he had to. Every Ranger knew their job and did it without needing constant direction. Fourth, it teaches us about teamwork. No single Ranger took Pointe du Hoc. It was accomplished through hundreds of individual acts working toward a common goal. When one man fell, another took his place. When someone needed help, help came. Finally, it teaches us about sacrifice. These men put everything on the line for something bigger than themselves. They didn't do it for glory or recognition. They did it because it needed to be done, and they were the ones who could do it. Standing at the edge. If you ever visit Normandy, make the journey to Pointe du Hoc. Stand at the edge of those cliffs. Look down at the beach below, 100 feet straight down. Try to imagine being weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment, bullets flying around you, grenades exploding nearby, and having to climb up. Then walk across the cliff top. See the craters, still there after all these years. Touch the concrete bunkers, still scarred by gunfire. Read the names on the monument of the men who fought there. And remember. Remember that freedom is never free. Remember that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they must. Remember that the world we live in today was shaped by the courage of men who climbed cliffs under fire on a June morning in 1944. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc didn't set out to be heroes. They were just doing their jobs. But in doing those jobs, they achieved something that will be remembered as long as people tell stories of courage and sacrifice. They took the cliffs. They destroyed the guns. They held their ground against impossible odds, and in doing so, they helped turn the tide of the greatest conflict in human history. That's why the Rangers climbed. That's why they fought. That's why they won. And that's why, 80 years later, we still stand in awe of what they accomplished on that terrible, glorious day at Pointe du Hoc. The mission was impossible. They did it anyway. That's what Rangers do. That's what heroes do. That's what Americans did on D-Day at a rocky promontory on the coast of France when the fate of the world hung in the balance and ordinary men rose to meet an extraordinary challenge. They climbed the cliffs under fire. They took Pointe du Hoc. And they changed history. The assault on Pointe du Hoc remains one of the most remarkable military operations in history. The courage displayed by those 225 Rangers and the 90 who were still standing at the end continues to inspire military forces around the world. Their story reminds us that when the mission is critical, when the stakes are highest, when failure is not an option, the human spirit is capable of incredible things. We honor their memory by remembering their story, by teaching it to new generations, and by striving to live up to the example they set on those cliffs. They gave everything for a cause larger than themselves. The least we can do is remember. They were Rangers. They led the way, and the world will never forget what they did at Pointe du Hoc.